Bob is going to stay back for our last conversation with U.S. Surgeon General Jerome Adams, who has only been in office for a few months, but has already identified the opioid crisis as one of his top priorities. He's been traveling to states reeling from this epidemic to learn more about the challenges they face and the resources they need. Please join me in welcoming the nation's Dr. Surgeon General Jerome Adams.
Hey, Doctor. Thank you, Doctor, for joining us. A lot of people in this field have personal connections to this epidemic. You have your brother is a connection that you've talked about publicly. Can you just describe some details about your brother?
Well, there's a great article out there about my experience growing up with my brother. And one of the things that pains me the most is that as a physician, as a public health advocate, as a Surgeon General, I couldn't prevent his pathway alone. And the lesson from the story is that if I can't do it alone, none of us can do it alone. It's why, as painful as it is, I continue to share that story. He suffered from what we now recognize as untreated mental health issues. He self-medicated. That went through a common pathway of tobacco to marijuana to pills and then to everything else. And he ended up committing criminal activity to support his habit and is now in state prison a few miles away from here in Maryland because of his addiction, still not getting treatment. And again, it's painful for me to sit in my office as Surgeon General of the United States while my brother sits in state prison. But that story is far too common for far too many of us.
We were talking with Senator Whitehouse. You visited Rhode Island. You're the nation's doctor. I'm sure you've done a lot of trips around the country. What have you learned outside the Beltway that Washington policymakers need to understand in combating this epidemic?
Well, the theme of the conference is recovery, and I think folks need to understand that recovery is a spectrum, and that spectrum starts with a touch point, and that touch point may be an ER where they've overdosed and been resuscitated. It may be a syringe service program. It may be just them hitting rock bottom and coming into a fire station where they've got great programs now that allow individuals to come in and just say, I need help, and get connected to help. From that touch point, they need to be connected to recovery support coaches. That is the best way, I think, to help individuals manage what is a complicated and needs to be individualized recovery process, to be able to talk to someone who knows the services who are available, who's been through that before. And then we need to help folks understand what is and what is not good treatment. And I heard you have a conversation with the senator and with the representative earlier that talked about good treatment, bad treatment. We need to do a better job of helping folks understand what that is. And we need to recognize treatment is for life. It has to be. You're in recovery for life, but we can, if we wrap people with the appropriate support services, help them have a higher success rate throughout their life. You're not going to be able to stay compliant if you don't have a house to live in. You're not going to be able to stay compliant if you don't have food on the table. We've got to be more innovative in terms of helping folks understand that providing all these services will increase their chances of success and ultimately lower cost. That's what I want Congress to know. That's what I want policymakers to know. We're not throwing good money after bad. We're actually getting a return on investment by wrapping people with the support services they need to be successful in recovery.
There are a lot of issues, and we also talked earlier about overprescribing, and the Attorney General said, listen, you got to take some aspirin and tough it out. Maybe that's a solution. Was that too flip, or do you think he has a point?
As an anesthesiologist, as a pain physician, I've always been in favor of multimodal. What we need to do, and one of the things I'm focused on as Surgeon General, is prevention and talking to healthcare providers about being smarter, about being better prescribers. And being a better prescriber means you don't even start with pills. You start thinking through the options that are available, physical therapy. You think through counseling. You offer a full array, a full menu of services that may or may not include pills and may or may not include opioids. But we also have to recognize that there are a lot of people with legitimate chronic pain out there. One of the things that the President's Commission recommended and that I talk with NIH Director Francis Collins about frequently is making sure we are continuing to innovate and come up with better options for pain management for folks so that we don't have this binary opioids or no opioids option for everyone, but we give everyone an appropriate menu and save the opioids for when they're really needed, but don't ignore legitimate chronic pain.
You are close to Vice President Pence. I've worked for him in Indiana. What did you learn in dealing with the HIV crisis? Thinking outside the box, such as needle exchanges. How is that past, dealing with that, thinking outside? How do we deal with this? Because a lot of people say we can't keep just doing what we're doing because it's not working. As a lot of congressmen have said,
Einstein called that insanity.
Yeah, exactly. So. What do you learn from there, and what are some outside the box things that people need to get out of their? We had the FDA commissioner, and he said people need to get out of their comfort zone here.
Great question, Bob. A really quick story. I ask folks, as a medical expert, as the public health commissioner, who do you think I called to solve the largest HIV outbreak related to injection drug use in the history of the United States? And people will say the CDC. They'll say, did you call Indiana University because we were in Indiana? I called the local Chamber of Commerce, the local faith-based leader, and the local sheriff. And I called them because we knew the science, we knew what we needed to do, but we needed the support of the individuals in the community who were the leaders, who were the policymakers, in order to help us implement the science in a way that the community would accept. So when you talk about thinking outside the box, we've got to think outside the silo. We've got to invite partners who normally wouldn't be at the table. And I'll give you a couple of really quick examples. Number one, I was speaking with Belden, which is a company in Richmond, Indiana, just 2 days ago. They're struggling to get enough people who can pass a drug screen to work in their factory. And so they're being innovative in the way they're looking at a negative drug screen. Instead of doing interview, and wasting, they set up to 4 or 5 hours through that process and then negative drug screen, and then they don't tell them anything, they just tell them you're not hired. They're drug screening right up front, and if folks test positive, they're going to try to connect them to recovery support services. They're going to connect them with a recovery coach. And if they're able to be successful to the extent that they feel like they can safely work, they're going to offer them an opportunity to work. And that helps them. As the representative mentioned earlier, oftentimes we find programs that do that. Those are their best workers, and you're giving folks hope. Instead of just getting you don't get hired for this job and you never know why, you have a connection to hope moving forward. And I mentioned the Scott County situation. The sheriff was critical. We know the science says syringe service programs halt spread of disease, but if the law enforcement community is waiting outside the syringe service program to arrest people when they come out or before they're going in, you're never going to be successful. Folks say we need to get away from a law enforcement approach. I would politely disagree with that, and I'll tell you my nuance on that. You know the #1 provider of mental health services in our country? It's our prison system. It's our prison and jail system. My public health officer in Scott County, Indiana, does not see people suffering from addiction nearly as frequently as my sheriff from Scott County. We have to help law enforcement have a public health informed approach to the way they tackle addiction, but we will never be able to remove law enforcement from the equation. We've got to figure out ways to better partner with them.
Interesting. We have time for a few questions. Please raise your hand, and one in the front right here. If you can just wait for the mic to come.
Sure. Hello, sir. Thank you very much for everything you said. My name is Anna. My day job is with a faith-based organization, but I'm also a performance improvement for a long-term residential drug rehab. And in both capacities on the policy arena, I am not hearing a lot about peer support services, which I think if we're talking about recovery, you absolutely need to talk about somebody who is there with passion, not just credentials. But I have a question about something you said, just wanted to follow up. I'm not sure I fully understood and wanted to be on the same page. When you speak about treatment is needed as a treatment for life, there seems to be a slight contradiction with the concept of recovery. I understand, especially from my capacity with the drug rehab, it's not always possible to help the person be completely drug-free. Everybody's at a different stage of addiction, at a different stage of health. But I know plenty of people who have gone through drug rehab and have been leading a completely drug-free life, addiction-free life for many years, no need for treatment on a daily basis. So was there a contradiction, or did I not fully understand the concept that you had?
Anna, thank you so much for that question, and I'm glad you asked and gave me a chance to clarify. When I say treatment for life, I mean they need the broader definition of treatment, the support, the access to behavioral health interventions, the things that we know are key to folks successfully remaining in recovery throughout their life. We know that the temptations, that the stresses will come back 10, 20, 30 years down the road. And if they have access to those recovery support services, that full gamut of what I consider treatment, then they are going to be much less likely to relapse. So that's my point. You wouldn't say to a diabetic, okay, we diagnosed you with diabetes, here's 30 days, or here's 6 months of treatment. You're cured, you're done. We don't need to ever check up on you again. We don't need to support you ever again, and we shouldn't do that for addiction. So thank you for the question. Again, wrapping people with a warm hug of support services for life is what's going to give us the best ROI and help people recover.
Thank you.
Over there.
You all can clap for that. Clap for recovery. Clap for recovery.
Is on. John Shimano with the Child Welfare League of America. We're struggling now with trying to give advice to Congress. There's a vague notion or idea in the law that talks about a plan of safe care for infants that are born exposed or dependent to substances. And do you have an idea what that might look like, both for obviously the infant and also the mother?
Sean, that's a wonderful question. As Indiana State Health Commissioner, I've lived through that. We saw our Department of Child Services become overwhelmed with children who were taken from homes and with trying to figure out how do you deal with an infant who's been born to a mother who's exposed. We know that having that infant in the home increases the mother's chance of recovery. And we ultimately want to keep families intact, but how do we keep individuals safe? So there's two different ways to go with your answer. There's the legal and what's safe for the child plan of care, and making sure that we have, again, recovery support options around that mother that maintain a safe environment for her and the individuals in the household. We have a responsibility to that infant to make sure we're not sending them home in a dangerous environment. But additionally, from a medical point of view, one of the things that we need more research on is what happens to these NAS babies once we've checked all the boxes and said, okay, you no longer have clinical medical NAS, see you in 5 or 6 years when they finally test you for problems at school or when you manifest in another way. We've got to do both of those things. We've got to have a medical plan for how we can better follow up with these individuals and a legal plan for how we can ensure safety but keep families intact. And I want to go back to something Anna said, if you will allow me for a quick minute, because you mentioned recovery, peer support. Absolutely critical. I want to tell you all a quick story about Jonathan, who I met in Rhode Island with Senator Whitehouse. Jonathan's father overdosed and died. Jonathan's brother overdosed and died. Jonathan overdosed. Fortunately, he was resuscitated with naloxone, and he was ready to walk out of the ER, but a recovery support coach came in, a peer who had been through it before, and talked to him and didn't judge him. That's one important thing is stigma is out there, and it was someone who wasn't going to judge him because they had been through it before, and just said, you know, I'm just here. I'm here for you. I'm not here to tell you what you did is wrong or to tell you what you need to do. I'm just here to talk. And that's what got Jonathan on the pathway to recovery. And now Jonathan is a recovery support coach. Peer recovery coaches are a critical missing link, and we need to do a better job of finding ways to fund and facilitate peer recovery services for all individuals.
I'm afraid we've run out of time. I want to thank you for being here. You can clap for recovery, and you can clap for the Surgeon General, Dr. Adams.
you.
I'll hand it over to